Hello, welcome back to my ramblings. Anna Gale here again with part 2 of the journey through the creation myth. Last episode, we began by looking at the first story within the Norse Cosmology timeline. Of course, this timeline does not really go in a straight line, but rather more wibbly-wobbly and cyclical like the Big Bang. We left off with the stage set for the first big crime in the mythology, one that follows a motif found in many hearth cultures around Midgard. But we aren't quite done with Ymir and Adumla yet. There is a bit more we can look at to inspire our imaginations to soar. So let's start with what they are and how they can be interpreted. Primordial beings, what are they? Well, the common agreement holds that they are powerful entities existing at the beginning of creation, like chaos, darkness, or nothingness. They are liminal in and of themselves, with no real ties to rules, laws, or time. They often reproduce by the act of parthenogenesis, at least at first. Their offspring begin to take on more orderly personalities as the universe progresses. Mostly, though maybe not in the Greek myths. When we encounter these beings, gender is often applied via the myths themselves. Academic scholars analyze strict constructs of male and female naming conventions to further solidify what pronouns to use. But assigning strict gender to a primordial being is probably a stretch. A primordial essence is going to be more fluid and changeable. It's going to follow the lines of confined chaos within a form that can adjust, shift, and morph at will. This idea of fluid primordialism may be where some of the beginnings of shape-shifting for various spirits and trickster deities are rooted. I mentioned this earlier in the last episode, and here we are again hinting at the concept for this discussion. I promise to tie it all together later in a different episode. Ymir can procreate on his own, if the lore is to be believed, which lends itself to the idea of a more gender-fluid being versus a specific male-centric character. The brief mention of Adumla revolves around a cow's 3 days of labor to lick free a full-grown man with no indication where this dude came from at all. He is just hanging around in the ice, waiting for a woman to lick him, which 3 days is impressive for a cow, if I may say. But if we stick to the constructs of Ymir being more male and Adumla being more female for simplicity's sake, then we have the first two entities within Norse cosmology that can create life, albeit at first on their own, without interaction with the other. They will become the building blocks for new worlds and different species that exist within the cosmology. The children of Ymir would be formed off his specific primordial energy. But the same thing does not occur with Adumla, according to Snorri. We are not given any examples of her birthing life from her own body. Now, an argument could be made regarding choosing a male to start life rather than a female would connect it to the Christian concept of a father-god motif. But where is the fun in that? I'm not really interested in those more scholarly motifs right now. What I find more compelling is the idea of what the text is referring to when talking about licking the salty rime. I should warn you at this juncture that if underage humans are listening with you, now would be an excellent time to send them off to bed, to complete their homework, or even go outside to play. I'll give you a moment to hit pause. Kiddos sent away? Excellent. We all know that academics love to make everything some sexual innuendo, so people will be interested in their papers regardless of how far-fetched. But I think there might be more to that argument with Snorri's description of Adumla's activities. Now hear me out. In defining Ymir and Adumla as forms of male and female energy, at some point mirroring patterns we see in other Indo-European cosmologies, we may need to consider that within lore no longer present, there were interactions between them physically. How these interactions were lost in Scandinavian lore is unclear. Maybe Snorri chose to omit for the delicate sensibilities of the time. Maybe his grandmother, the primary source for his tales, didn't share those intimacies with a small boy at the fireside. Yet, perhaps remnants of it remain in the case of this one line where licking the salty rime becomes a euphemism for either oral sex, or for the actual physical act, whatever floats your boat, or theirs as the case may be. And on a side note, researching euphemisms for blowjobs is quite eye-opening and giggle-producing. No matter the century, ribald humor always exists. Humans are dirty, dirty creatures. Getting back to the beaten path, we have Adumla, who, while described as a cow, may have actually been far more. She's tongue-jobbing Ymir and having a kid, Buri. More beings had to emerge from these two, or Buri would not have begat a son, Bor, by some unnamed female, nor Bor hooking up with Besla to beget children like a conveyor belt, three of whom decide to cause a ruckus that carries the timeline of the mythology forward to its next phase. This beginning story is rife with nuggets of innuendo that lend themselves to far more than just a salt lick. Oh, the fun to be had. Other myths set the stage for world building in similar fashion. In Finland, we have the Virgin of Air, who descends into the ocean with a capital O, the waters lapping against her. She then is called the Mother of Waters as her pregnancy becomes obvious. For 700 years, good Lord, she floated within the waters, nourishing her unborn child, observing her surroundings, and getting repeatedly laved by the ocean with a capital O. The Celts, on the other hand, had several stories. A divine mare, born of sea foam, who gives birth to the first gods, similar to the castration of Uranus and the birth of Aphrodite. The great song, which played within the primordial abyss, growing louder and louder until it birthed all things. Orgasm, anyone? The void from which the goddess Danu emerges similar to an actual birthing. In Gaul, acorns dropped from the great oak tree to form the gods, and then from the same bark or berries of that tree, the gods created humans. Way to repurpose and recycle. The Slavs had a primordial egg, or mist, that contained the first deity who then emerges to create the worlds. Eggs feature prominently in creation, which, lends itself as the answer to the which came first, the chicken or the egg question. It was the egg. From here, the leap is made to a sacrifice of some sort that creates the actual worlds, where these and other beings will eventually live. The form that this sacrifice takes varies, though. For the Mother of Waters, a great bird lays eggs in a nest it creates on one of her knees. As the bird sits on the eggs, heat begins to build. When the heat becomes so great that it burns her, she thrashed and kicked the nest off, sacrificing the eggs as they broke open and are eventually used by her child to create the earth and all the creatures tied to it. In Proto-Indo-European myth, there's this first man, Manu, who sacrifices his brother Yemo to forge the natural world. We also see sacrifice in Greek myths for Gaia and Rhea, where their partners lose life or limb at the hands of their children. In Norse lore, Ymir becomes the sacrifice to build order, and Adumla disappears entirely. To commit this atrocity, and circle back around to the original plotline of this episode, the three sons of Bor and Besla step forward. I ended the last podcast by breaking down how the three brothers were related to Ymir. The idea of familial relationships in this context was to simply explain why the first great evil brought into the world is a kinslaying. Not everyone will agree with this definition, as they do not recognize Ymir as a blood relation to Odin Villian-Bey. But the connection is still there, and the blinders need to be removed. I think heathens and scholars follow only the line of Bor that comes from Adumla regarding the lineage of Odin. But Besla's parentage ties back to Ymir through her father, Bolthorn. We do not have a listing of her father's parentage, nor her mother's. But if Snorri is to be believed, Adumla only brought Buri into being, and he only has Bor from some mysterious woman, who we don't know where she comes from. This leaves Besla to be a direct descendant of Ymir through her parents, and Odin to be a descendant through his mother. However, The odds that no other beings came from Adumla are low, and with what was out in the cosmos to choose from, these kissing cousins are all related to Ymir eventually through any parental lines. In Christian cosmology, the first evil, not counting the fall, is supposedly when Lilith rejects Adam. Yahweh then creates Eve to be Adam's personal plaything from then on, even as they curse Lilith to demonhood for standing up for herself. Eve is enticed to eat an apple that grants her the ability to know the truth of all things, including that the first man is a selfish child. She offers the apple to Adam because she knows how to share. Adam has the ability and agency to say no, mind you. Instead, he takes a bite, which begins the descent into a litany of hating and shaming women across the centuries. And speaking plainly about these types of behaviors makes patriarchal societies within Christianity highly upset. But I was raised Baptist, so I remember well how it works. Their entire motif is blame the woman for all evils to avoid their own accountability, which sounds pretty familiar even today. In Norse cosmology, though, the female roles are downplayed to the point where we don't have a lot of written information, and the fault for any evils lie squarely in the hands of the men that commit the atrocities where it belongs. There are no excuses offered. Interestingly enough, Snorri doesn't seem to recognize the irony of this. A Christian scholar writing down stories that clearly show it's the man's fault. Instead, he justifies it by giving it a little twist to grant an attempted nobility and states they wanted to bring order to the chaos and the evil that was Ymir. But to reiterate, Ymir wasn't evil. He was neither evil nor good. He just existed, sweating, rubbing his feet together, and drinking milk. He was just lying there with his ass in a crack, minding his own business, and then these three hooligans come up and slaughtered him for no apparent reason. Hooligans that were descended of his own bloodlines, for crying out loud. And to understand why this event is so blasphemous, a quick explanation of key elements within Scandinavian societies is in order. Now, I will briefly cover these 2 points here to help guide the listener, but I reserve the right to extensive explanations for another time. And this is just a gloss over. Point number 1. A killing or slaying and a murder were not necessarily the same thing. While both are still wrong, if the individual doing the killing/slaying takes ownership of the death in front of witnesses, then suit can be brought before the Althing and a punishment assigned. This punishment could range from were-gild paid for the value of the life, different classes were worth different amounts, to lesser outlawry, to greater outlawry, or to the death of the slayer. Not Buffy. Were-gild, in this instance, is a price set on the value of the individual. Men, women, children, slaves, yes, slaves, servants, all had a price that was determined based on their connection and usefulness to the household impacted by the death. It's actually written down in the law books. Lesser outlawry was exile from their homeland for a set period of time, usually something between 3 to 5 years, but could be more if political tensions were high. The killer was allowed to set their affairs in order and to provide for any family while they were away. They then left the country and traveled for a while, getting into scrapes and building up wealth where they could. Please remember that this is a gross underrepresentation of a very complex system. Once their punishment was complete, the killer was free to return to their lands. Greater outlawry, however, was much more severe. They might be banished for decades or forever, losing all of their worldly goods, be shunned from society as a whole, even be hunted down and marked for death before they can even get out of the country. Their families often shared in some of the societal shunning as their status would diminish by the actions of the slayer. Again, not Buffy. The last and most severe course of action would be death. Think an eye for an eye type of mentality. This was extreme and not something that was often chosen. Settlements were sparse, the population were much reduced at this time. And the taking of another life when there were not that many to begin with could be the difference between plenty and starvation for those left behind. It wasn't a punishment to be taken lightly. Then we have murder. Murder is where a killer takes a life and then doesn't do anything about it, essentially hiding what they've done. They take no ownership. They may not even grant appropriate covering or burial for the deceased. They just leave them for the animals to desecrate and for a friend or family member to eventually discover. They don't disappear. They have no remorse. They just go about their lives, behaving as if the person they slaughtered had so little value it wasn't even worth claiming the kill. No weregild is offered, no explanation as to why the death was deemed necessary. So you can see how murder is going to be a much more severe course of action. An individual accused of murder often had their lives forfeited as well. Occasionally, they end up in front of the All-Thing and received a sentence of greater outlawry, but usually a posse finds the perpetrator first and does their best to end them long before an All-Thing is convened. Murder is chaos and flaunts the rules set down by the people. So point number 2 is a duty to avenge and the ties that bind. Connections are prized in a world where the next settlement could be days or weeks away. They are a matter of survival in the harsher climates of the north. A brief list of connections would be bloodkin, marriage, fostering, parent-child, lordship, friendship, blood brother or sister bonds, and even treaties. If someone is killed that has a close relationship to person A, that person has a duty through that connection to avenge the death against the killer, whether through the All-Thing, a private settlement, or taking a life in exchange. All of these are options. In an ideal situation, both sides agree that after the payment of weregild or judgment of outlawry, or a subsequent second death on the other side of the dispute, things have been balanced out and there is no need to pursue it further. The matter is then considered settled. However, this rarely happens, as someone always ends up as a heckler, urging on more of the bloodshed to avenge a slight to their honor. And to be honest, it's usually a woman doing the heckling. Let's try to keep this simple. Person A in A camp kills a person in B camp. Urged on by someone who takes the death very hard, person 1 in B camp will then take up arms to avenge the death by killing someone in A camp. Then a heckler in A camp will demand retaliation and begin calling on the connections to others to wreak vengeance on B camp. This continues back and forth, breaking down the ties that bind and increasing the death toll, which usually results in a higher-ranked person stepping in to finally cease the hostilities. These relationships are built with delicate threads that, when pulled too tightly, result in blood feuds that can last generations. Many of the Icelandic sagas are filled with these plot lines, along with some pretty impressive insults. So with these 2 points, we have ties that bind with the duty to avenge and ownership of a killing to set up the next part of the creation saga. In early Scandinavia, we can level up on types of death with one of the worst wrongs that can be committed: kinslayings. And keep my earlier explanations from the last episode and this one at the forefront of your mind while we meander through this, because we are about to blow those concepts out of the primordial waters. The reason kinslayings are so horrendous is that there's no way to avenge them, even when they are claimed by the killer. There's no way to balance the scales. Think about it. You cannot pay weregild because it's coming out of your coffers and going right back into your coffers. You cannot get someone to kill the person who has committed the slaying because they are also your relation, and it will make you a kinslayer as well. While outlawry could be done, when the killer returns, there is still the stain of having killed a relation to combat for the rest of their days. When there is no way to correct the wrong done to the very foundation of your tribe or clan, your society is in jeopardy of falling apart. And this is when bad things start to happen. We see it in Beowulf with the Frisians and the son who killed his brother. We also see it here in Norse mythology when Odin, Vili, and Ve slaughter the progenitor of their bloodlines. Bad things start to happen shortly after the killing, and this is where we may see Odin's obsession with gaining more power and knowledge come into being. By creating the world from their ancestors' remains, as Ymir has now become their ancestor through his demise, the brothers are setting forth into motion the events that will eventually take them down the road to Ragnarok. They have thrown the scales of the universe out of sync and hope to create order out of such destruction. But how can it hope to last with such a beginning? So here we are, Odin, Vili, and Ve wrecked everything with the kinslaying. Now there will be people out there that say, oh, well, this was the very beginning. They wouldn't have had a definition for kinslaying, or even have understood the concept of paying weregild during this period of time. But I don't think you're giving them enough credit. If they created the idea of kinslaying for societies to base their social constructs on, then the brothers knew exactly what it was, and exactly what they did. No one told them to kill Ymir. No one told them to create different worlds from his body parts, which really gives me the it puts the lotion on its skin vibes. Odin, Vili, and Ve took that decision upon themselves. They looked around their environment and determined not to like the world they were currently living in. This world was filled with Jotnar and Ettins, whether they were frost, fire, land giants, or any others. It displeased them, so they decided to change it. But they did it starting with a killing. That is definitely not the best way to kick off change, in my opinion. But as a secondary justification, they may have also wanted to stop Ymir from creating more life, and while admittedly it has a definite ew factor, this could be construed as a precursor to racial genocide. I know, I'm throwing a lot of deep-thinking, hardcore concepts at you right now. Ain't mythology fun? The brothers begin the slaughter by chopping Ymir into pieces. His blood, or life force, surges forth in such quantity as to create a tsunami-like wave of bodily fluids across the neighboring areas, flooding the lands and drowning nearly all of Ymir's children within a certain proximity. The texts list only one named male and an unnamed wife that survived the flood in a boat. Sound familiar? Bergelmere, who vows vengeance upon the sons of Bor as their boat takes them to some undisclosed location. We get the following listing for parsing Ymir's body parts from multiple sources: Grimnismal, Voluspa, Vafthrudnir saying, and lines from the Fooling of Gylfi and the Prose Edda. Ymir's physical body formed the earth. Broken bones, teeth, and the jaw created pebbles and small stones. Unbroken bones created larger rocks. Remnants of his blood that had pooled became seas and lakes. The blood flooding across Gununga Gap created the oceans. His hair created the trees and probably some shrubs, but that second part is just my opinion. The eyelashes were used to create Midgard itself, separate from Earth as a whole. From his brain was formed the clouds, and at this point the body had begun to decompose during the parsing, bringing up wriggling, maggot-like creatures that the brothers turned into dwarves. Ymir's skull was then lifted above to form the sky and heavens, with 4 of the dwarves placed to hold it up at each corner: Austri, or east, Vestri, or west, Nordri, north, and Sudri, south. And I most likely mispronounced all 4 of those names. 2 sparks from Gununga Gap are then thrown into the skies to light the heavens and earth, and they would eventually become the sun, or Sol, and the moon, Mond. In combining these poems and prose, we receive a somewhat full rendering of Ymir's bodily separation. His primordial essence infused into all of creation as 3 of his descendants felt it should be allocated. The myth then moves on to the next phases for world building, setting time, which I will review in another podcast, and creating people. At this point, we have no mention of other various deities that we will see listed later by Snorri. We don't know anything about their origins. What is further swept under the rug is the fact that Odin is a Jotun himself, as are his brothers Vili and Ve. There is also no clan or tribe name assigned for various groups of land, fire, or ice Jotuns. They are only referenced as Jotnar in a whole body. Yet the term Aesir is used to describe Odin's specific tribe, and is one of the few names that we see referencing a particular group of individuals. Once these groups are defined and coalesced, though, hierarchy and power must be established to hold them together, which is what Odin sets out to do throughout the lore. The slaying of Ymir begins this garnering of power by Odin. He, Vili, and Ve, I think in one of the other renditions it's Honir and Lother, begin to walk the lands they have built after slaughtering their kinsmen. Over the course of the journey, they come across 2 pieces of deadwood lying frozen on a sandy beach. Ask and Embla, the first people, were gazed upon by the brothers, and these people were given breath, life, and fair complexion to begin their existence. With these gifts granted, the world of man begins and creates a hierarchy that places Odin at the forefront of any worship or acknowledgement. He is not the hero, though. He has a kenning, known as betrayer for good reason. He betrayed the progenitor of his line, his ancestor. He betrayed his people, the existing lives of the Jotnar, with a kinslaying. The lore shows a constant betrayal for those he comes up against, even when he gives his word otherwise. He is an oath breaker. He is an asshole. He breaks the social constructs willingly, and therefore cannot be the hero of any story. He should not be the one that all the other gods look up to, but that is how Snorri wrote it down. Instead, Odin must be the one that is placed on the outside to restore balance, yet isn't. He is the outdweller. Through his actions and that of his brothers, Odin is creating for himself a separateness from the remaining Jotnar left behind from the slaying of Ymir. And labeling his particular tribe as the Aesir, he further establishes this otherness to elevate and establish a higher dominion. This completely ignores the problem his grandfather's death sets into the scales of the cosmos. There is no weregild paid. Indeed, he cares nothing about restoring balance at all. Instead, Odin forces his will by creating a world out of betrayal and firmly places the gods in Uthengard rather than Inengard from the very start. To offer a simple definitions for those terms, Uthengard would be something close to outer land, while Inengard would be inner land, the two separated by some sort of boundary. The concept is that you want to be on the inside of things instead of the outside. The outside lends itself to chaos, while inside is safety. What do we mean by other? The idea of otherness can be best described by a group that is outside the societal norms, mostly because they are breaking the rules by committing wrongs that are at cross purposes as a whole, or they are extraordinarily different from the mainstream. They cannot be allowed back into the fold without restitution or conforming of a sort. The myths try to paint the Jotnar as the ones that are outside. But what if it's the other way around? What if it was always the other way around and Snorri changed it to fit his own ideologies that would make the Aesir the heroes instead of the ones that had committed the evils? Stay with me here. Think for a minute on some of the more late 20th, early 21st century authors that took stories such as The Wizard of Oz or Cinderella, and they gave you the tale from the viewpoint of the evil stepsister or the wicked witch. And through this retelling, helped you to see a different way of looking at the events in the story. Suddenly, you are no longer considering these individuals as wholly evil, but merely a product of choices and decisions within the entire world that they exist in. You receive the bigger picture instead of just one side. It's the same with Norse cosmology. Snorri took the stories of the Aesir and made them his heroes. However, it may be necessary to step outside that construct and instead look at it from a different direction to recognize that they were not the heroes. They were the ones that caused the problems in the first place. They are other, and this otherness began with a kinslaying. Right now, heathens listening to this definition and scenario are screaming in outrage because there's no possible way that could be true. I'm not saying it's the truth. Instead, I'm asking you to suspend the commonly held belief and see it through new eyes, through another set of lenses. This new viewpoint may help to see the stories afresh and inspire new heights with interpretation and learning, even going so far as to make your own conclusions about the material that we have right now, rather than just going along with the popular kids. Think of the possibilities it could open up. Think of the gaps that could be filled. And before moving on to the next point, we should ask a simple question that I know is drumming through the heads of listeners regarding the kinslaying. Wasn't the creation of the world the Were-Guild? How? It would be paying your own coffers and thus not truly restitution. Remember the Frisians in Beowulf? We see a distinct lack of interest in balance that becomes evident when Odin builds his realms and sets up his power hierarchy. Vili and Ve eventually drop out of the picture entirely, similar to Adumla, leaving no trace of what happens to them, a pattern that becomes commonplace in Snorri's book. We are left with no resolution until the events of Ragnarok. So no, creation of the worlds is not Were-Guild. We may not have all the original stories, or even more than one version for existing ones, but it becomes the responsibility of people today, whether they are scholars, literary gurus, or pagan practitioners, to sit down, look at this material, and see what can be built to fill in gaps that make sense in conjunction with what exists. There's a propensity to make up stories, trying to give an idea of what we are missing, but we have so very little preserved. Connecting these new stories to what exists becomes a requirement in order to be taken seriously. We want to give it the oomph it needs to be credible yet entertaining. Sometimes we think it's divinely inspired, but we cannot always take that as fact. To be fair, there may be instances where the gods have spoken to a writer, filling in the missing stories, but the new material still must fit within the existing cosmology and deity personalities to work. It must link with lore seamlessly enough to be plausible. Conversely, when different authors are sharing multiple stories of the same events, we also need to acknowledge that sometimes it's just for entertainment purposes. The gaps make the material that we have flawed, but does it mean we cannot use it at all? Of course not. Within the existing lore from Norse cosmology, we do have references to stories, ideas, names, and epithets, and supposedly memories. When describing tales referenced in the myths, these memories and ideas have not been preserved in their entirety that we know of thus far. So how do we account for these time lapses, these memory lapses, these myth lapses? Well, partly, we can fill in the gaps with nuances we detect within the various myths themselves. We can read between the lines and see what isn't said versus what is said within the myth. We can ask questions that force us to review the tales in a different light. Like, what happened to Adumla? Why did the brothers decide it was Ymir that had to be slain? What happened between the slaying and their eventual journeys? What else did they discover on their journeys? What vengeance did Bergelmere exact for the slaying of his grandfather? Snorri doesn't tell us. All we have is that the universe was created by a violent act committed by beings who cared so little for the impact of their actions until they could avoid it no more. But by expanding our understanding through these gaps, asking the unpopular questions, risking the censorship and dismissal of the pagan community and academics as a whole, we can approach the lore with a different mindset and see the whole picture rather than just one side, keeping the set idea of heroes and deities under a microscope where it belongs. Whew! Well, that was a wild ride. I hope I gave you food for thought, spinning threads of inspiration and insight across the airwaves. Listen, I'm not here to give you answers. The powers that be are more than capable of that. I am here to make you think outside the box, to think from the side of Udngar and allow a little chaos to move you out of stagnant beliefs. The lore isn't meant to be a stationary thing. It lives and grows as we allow it to. Folks, have a wonderful week as we approach these fall days into winter night celebrations. Remember your connection with the divine. And with all the chaos going on in the world, don't forget to find your sacred breath.